7. Enjoy. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Flatt, an assistant professor and sports medicine graduate program director at Georgia Southern University. Andrew has a PhD in human performance from the University of Alabama, where he worked with football, swimming, and soccer. He has an extensive athletic background, including hockey, rugby, collegiate football, and raw powerlifting, and his research interest is in heart rate variability and its application to monitoring training status in athletes. Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time today.
It's a pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, maybe you can kick off this conversation by telling us a little more about your background in sport and powerlifting and how that sort of dovetailed into your career in academia.
Yeah, so I grew up playing sports. I'm actually originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, but my dad's job moved us to Toronto. So I grew up in the Toronto area and naturally played a lot of hockey.
Nice.
Played in Richmond Hill for the Richmond Hill Stars for many years. But I probably overdid it with hockey. It was club hockey in Richmond Hill. It was school hockey. It was hockey on the PlayStation and the Sega, and then there was mini hockey in the basement. And
pretty easy to do in Toronto area, isn't it? Overdoing it with hockey.
Yeah, and actually, I shouldn't admit this, but I grew up a big time Pittsburgh Penguins fan mostly because Mario Lemieux, who I think is the best hockey player ever. So
amazing.
But so I kind of burnt out with hockey. I kind of lost interest in it. I started playing a bit of rugby in high school and then football. And football brought me to Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And I played there from 2004 to 2008. We won a national championship in 2005. And that's really kind of where I started to grow my interest in strength and conditioning. Right out of university, I took a strength and conditioning job at a private high school just north of Toronto, where I coached as a football coach, the defensive line, and got into competitive powerlifting. And through my competitive powerlifting, I went through some stages of overreaching and, bombed out, pulled out of meets and so forth. I was trying to find a better way to guide my training so I could know when I should back off and kind of prevent these major decrements in performance rather than just trying to following a strict plan. I probably read some advanced textbooks way too early that were way over my head. For example, one of the first books I read was Super Training,
Nice.
which I'm sure you're familiar with that book. I probably should have started with a book like Starting Strength or one of Mike Boyle's books, something that's, real practical. But I learned about cybernetic periodization, which is, what does that mean?
Incredible.
Yeah. And so I started to take an interest in, okay, maybe we don't need to follow a strict plan to get us to where we want to be, but we could be a little bit more fluid with things. And eventually I found HRV just kind of on the internet, learning about overtraining and so forth. Landon Evans was using HRV with athletes. So I was like, all right, I got to look into this. I purchased an iPod Touch at the time. This is back in like 2010. I bought an iPod Touch just for the sole reason that I could use an HRV application. The only one on the market at the time. Yeah, the only one on the market at the time was iFleet. So I ordered a chest strap and the receiver that you plug in, and I got started. And I've literally been doing it every day ever since. Just seeing how it responds to different things, just personal experimentation, and then that led me into the research side of things. I was making some really interesting observations, just seeing how it was responding to stress, to travel, to illness. And I was thinking, this would be great working with athletes, which is, what I was doing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that brought me to pursue a master's degree. And I wanted to go move south of the border because strength and conditioning at the time was, it was much bigger down in the U.S.
For sure.
Got accepted into a master's program just south of Pittsburgh at a place called CalU. Got a graduate assistantship position there as a strength and conditioning coach. So I was able to work with athletes and directed all my coursework to digging into the available research on heart rate variability, which at the time was pretty much exclusively on endurance athletes. So, I was like, I'm interested in powerlifting and sports like football and hockey and rugby. Am I barking up the wrong trees? Does this have any application? And based on my personal experience with it, I certainly believed that it could be of some use. So, from that point on, I was like, well, I want to start researching this tool with team sport athletes, with anaerobic athletes, and kind of the rest is history. I determined that the PhD route is probably something that would work out for me, or something that I'd be interested in doing. I was terrified of actually pursuing it. The fear of failure.
Absolutely.
But I ended up meeting a professor at an NSCA conference. Dr. Mike Esco has become my really good friend. Long story short, we hit it off at a conference. I ended up going to work with him in his lab at Auburn University in Montgomery campus. And we did some research together. I taught a few courses. Once I had a paper or two under my belt, I applied for the PhD program at Alabama. They gave me a chance. I got in, and I ran with it. And was very fortunate to make some connections at Alabama and work with some of the athletics teams there, including the women's soccer team, the sprint swimmers, and football, which I ended up doing my dissertation with. And that brings me to my first faculty position. I'm now at Georgia Southern University at the Savannah campus, living near the beach where I don't have to shovel my driveway in. It's great.
Vitamin D status is looking good these days, right?
Absolutely.
Well, listen, I'm looking forward here to diving into your work around HRV and team sport, but maybe before we do that, we can kind of zoom back out to 30,000 feet and get listeners on the same page here and perhaps do a quick review of the basic physiology of HRV and what exactly you're measuring here.
Yeah, so heart rate variability is just simply the measurement of time between beats. Your heart rate varies in response to respiration. Our intrinsic heart rate beats at a rate of about 100 beats per minute. That's if we were to sever any nerves from it. The SA node will depolarize and beat the heart at about 100 beats per minute. But through innervation of the vagus nerve, we could actually slow heart rate down below 100 beats per minute. And with sympathetic nerves, we can accelerate heart rate over 100 beats per minute. And so the heart rate variability itself there's nothing magical about the time between heartbeats. It's really what it's reflecting, and it reflects autonomic nervous system function. And I think Stephen Porges said it best when he says the autonomic nervous system plays a fundamental role in the physiological expression of stress. And so if we believe that stress impacts recovery status, if it impacts health, sleep quality, then it might be something we want to track and quantify. And heart rate variability serves as a reasonably good indicator of stress. Now, what are the determinants of heart rate variability? Heart rate variability varies from person to person for a number of reasons. There's some studies that have looked at heritability estimates of heart rate variability, and about 40 to 48% of your heart rate variability is explained by your genetics. Your age is, as you get older too, heart rate variability tends to decrease. Mm-hmm. Your sex can also play a role. Women tend to have higher HRV than men, and even your race. So African Americans tend to have higher heart rate variability than European Americans. Your aerobic fitness, the more aerobically fit you are, you can start to modify some of this. So you can offset the age-related decline in heart rate variability if you maintain or build up your aerobic fitness. Your body fat would be another one. So the higher your body fat, you tend to have lower heart rate variability. In my experience and based on the research that I've seen, the major factors that affect heart rate variability by far are your sleep, your exercise or your training load, and any type of mental or psychological stress. To a lesser extent, we could impact heart rate variability through our nutrition. And I say to a lesser extent simply because there's not as much research in this area, but of the available research, it appears that making sure our omega-3 fatty acid intake, can help with heart rate variability or help improve heart rate variability. And I've seen one study that found an association between green vegetable intake and heart rate variability.
Nice. Good way to get the greens in for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And then alcohol. HRV is pretty sensitive to alcohol. One drink probably won't have too much of a negative effect, but several drinks, and I'd put my money on it that your HRV the next day is going to be much lower than normal. So bringing this to athletics and monitoring athletes and so forth, Jamie Stanley, Paul Orson, and Martin Boucher wrote an excellent systematic review in Sports Medicine back in 2013, detailing the typical HRV responses to training. And this gives us a model to kind of have an expectation of what we might expect to see in athletes, just to start off with. And so short-term recovery of heart rate variability could take minutes to hours, and it's affected by plasma catecholamines, lactate concentrations, your body temperature when that returns to normal values, and so forth. Longer term recovery, we're talking 24, 48 hours later, appears to be related to changes in fluid balance homeostasis and plasma volume changes. There's probably some endocrine factors that may play a role there as well. After a low intensity session, because we're not accumulating as much metabolites and so forth, recovery will be much quicker. HRV shouldn't change too much from day to day with low intensity aerobic exercise, but with high intensity high intensity training, it could take, depending on your fitness level, 24 to 48 hours. So what I would expect to see in response to a high intensity training session is a decrease in HRV from baseline the next day, and then it should come back up to baseline 48 hours later, maybe even above baseline. But what I've observed and what I've seen indirectly in some of the studies that I've done with some of my colleagues is the first exposure to high intensity training will provoke a pretty substantial response in HRV, but when you administer that dose of training again, or even if you increase the dose a little bit, it's managed much better, and I mean that's reflecting adaptation. So,
100%, and segues fantastically into your applications in team sport and some of your early work that you did in soccer players and assessing the individual HRV responses to preseason training. So if we kind of start here in that preseason training camp mentality of obviously athletes coming off an off season. Can you share some of the themes that you picked up in your study and that practitioners or coaches might see in preseason athletes?
Yeah, you know what? I'm glad you brought up preseason, because preseason is a very interesting time of the year where everything you think you know about heart rate variability, assuming you don't have an advanced understanding of it, it changes a little bit. And this after working preseason with a women's soccer team, and the football team, what you expect to happen doesn't necessarily happen, and that's because we expect an increase in these training loads. We're expecting to see fatigue accumulate and HRV decrease. And what I'm seeing, and this largely has to do with temperature conditions. So being in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in August, it's hot outside. It's over 30 degrees Celsius and, over 80% humidity every day. And that's probably a cool day.
And pads and everything too in the football team, right?
Absolutely. So this paper that I'm referring to right now is currently in production. I haven't even submitted it yet, but I could tell you, normally an athlete after an increase in training load, we're going to see some pretty substantial reductions in HRV. But when you factor in heat stress, that's stimulating some adaptations, particularly plasma volume expansion, which actually increases heart rate variability. And so when we're a couple days into camp, and I'm thinking this fatigue is accumulating, and they might even be reporting some perceived fatigue, I'm actually starting to see HRV increase, and there's evidence or there's research showing that there's something called parasympathetic hyperactivity in overreached athletes. But these are endurance athletes. These football players and soccer players are not going through these massive volumes of endurance training. It's so parasympathetic hyperactivity from that perspective is not what's happening. What's happening most likely is this expansion of plasma volume, which is stimulating this increase in parasympathetic activity and therefore an increase in HRV, despite the fact that they're feeling fatigued. And so I think one might take a look at that and dismiss HRV and say, well, it's not a very good measure of recovery or fatigue if it's increasing while they're getting tired during camp. But I would say, well, you got to interpret it in the appropriate context. It's heart rate variability is probably more appropriately considered a marker of adaptation. And if you have athletes training in the heat, you want plasma volume to expand because it gives you more fluid to work with, so you could sweat a little bit more without it drastically affecting your heart rate, and you could thermoregulate better. So that's a very positive adaptation to training. Now, I would say outside of this preseason and the heat, where we were, and credit to Martin Boucher for a lot of his work in this and team sport athletes, and he found that increases in plasma volume throughout preseason training are associated with a decrease in exercise heart rate and increases in aerobic exercise and so forth. And I'm pretty sure that's what we were seeing. So anyone who's applying HRV in athletes and looking, only for reductions in HRV to be a meaningful indication of fatigue or recovery, if you have athletes training in the heat, you might want to be mindful that HRV might start to increase after a few days. One previous paper in the American Journal of Sport Medicine found almost a 10% expansion of plasma volume in college football players, and about a week into camp, which is what I was seeing. So
it's amazing, yeah, the context and the nuance that's involved when you start to change parameters, like the ambient temperature, and because in your original work there with soccer players, obviously having at the start of preseason seeing these greater variances and lower scores in HRV, and then as the training camp moved on, then correct me if I'm wrong here, the fitter players were seeing improvements in the HRV, whereas some of the players who were perhaps not as adapting as well to the training were still seeing some of those lower scores. Is that correct?
Yeah, and to interpret a change in HRV, looking at the HRV alone is going to be very difficult to determine how they're responding. I mean,
absolutely.
So we take into consideration the wellness questionnaire. We had the polar team system, so we were measuring their loads with that.
It tends to dovetail pretty well, doesn't it, Andrew? The daily wellness and the HRV in general terms.
In general, I'm always reluctant to say yes, because then the expectation is that there's a perfect relationship there.
For sure.
One of our recent studies in sprint swimmers, we literally examined that. When someone rates their sleep quality, their stress, or their fatigue or soreness, when they rate that better than usual, what is their HRV versus when they rate it, what we would consider their average or worse than average. And yeah, it was the model was significant when they rated that their stress and sleep quality and everything, when it was all better than normal, their HRV on average was higher than normal, and so on and so forth. So in general, there is absolutely a relationship there, but there are context dependent factors. And now I'm kind of starting to think about heart rate variability applications and trying to determine recovery, or using a green light, or telling you how to train. You can be feeling great and well recovered on game day and have a very low heart rate variability score because of some pre-competitive anxiety. Mm-hmm. And your autonomic nervous system, like Stephen Porges says, it plays a fundamental role in the physiological expression of stress. Now, whether you're stressed from homework or you're excited and anxious for a game, it's expressed the same way, but you need to interpret that and determine, the case. Because if an athlete's looking at that score, they might be concerned, oh my gosh, this is telling me I'm not recovered. When that's not the case at all. So, and that's where I sometimes just get reluctant to say that, yes, they relate really well. In general, they do, but there's always exceptions to the rule there. And the plasma volume changes during training in the heat is one. Pre-competitive anxiety is one. We could see mismatches in HRV and perceptual markers there. Also, there's something called parasympathetic saturation, which essentially, if your heart rate is super low, you can end up with really low heart rate variability at the same time, which is explained by just an abundance of acetylcholine in the myocardium from really high parasympathetic activity. And
we tend to see that most in the endurance and Ironman crowd. Is that?
Yes, absolutely, and particularly when measured in the supine position. And so we've moved away. We use exclusively the seated or standing position for trying to avoid saturation being one reason. There's other reasons why we like that position as well. But so yes, absolutely. I think HRV can serve as a great indicator of recovery. It's a great indicator of adaptation. But a new time user of heart rate variability really needs to manage their expectations. If you go in assuming that high is good and low is bad, and that it's black and white, you're going to end up being a little bit confused and probably disappointed, and you may end up dismissing it if you can't interpret some responses in appropriate context. And kind of to add on to that, I think a major criticism of heart rate variability is if someone starts measuring it and they see that it fluctuates quite a bit on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of dismissed as being not reliable and therefore not useful. And kind of what I've learned is if you measure HRV for an appreciable amount of time, you find that the amount or the magnitude of fluctuation is actually meaningful. It means something. So the amount of fluctuation in your HRV trend on a day-to-day basis changes and it evolves over time, and it responds based on how you are responding to training. Less fit individuals tend to show much greater day-to-day fluctuation than higher fit individuals. In fact, when I compared the Olympic swimmers at Alabama versus the non-Olympic level swimmers, the Olympic level swimmers, their day-to-day fluctuation during normal training was we use a value called the coefficient of variation, which is really just their standard deviation normalized to their average. And they had levels that were 3% or less. And there was only 6 Olympians, but I mean they all during kind of this preparatory training where there was no overload or anything. I mean, there was progressive overload, but we weren't trying to overreach anyone. Their coefficient of variation was 3% or less. And so, and what we find is when we introduce, we could be starting a training camp or we're introducing a novel stimulus, you're going to see much greater day-to-day fluctuation. There's a stimulus taking place. But what should happen over time is the magnitude of that fluctuation should decrease and your score should become more stable if you're adapting well to the training stimulus. And we're finding correlations in the highest level athletes in collaboration with Dan Howells and Olympic level rugby sevens players. We introduce I just helped analyze the data and write the paper. Dan Howells is a strength and conditioning coach, and they introduced the stimulus. And sure enough, when training loads spike, there is greater day-to-day fluctuation almost across the board. But then when they go into the second week of intensified training, and I'm expecting things to get worse because we're increasing loads a second time. And what ends up happening is everyone's scores kind of revert back or even get to less and less fluctuation than at baseline. And I'm thinking, well, that is counter to kind of everything I thought about what fluctuation means. But it ended up, I assumed that second exposure to high intensity training load was going to increase fatigue even further. That was my expected response that we would have observed, and that wasn't the case. I think that they increased loads further because they were adapting so well. Because I mean, we found a pretty strong correlation, negative 0.74. Between their change in how much fluctuation they had in their HRV and their change in maximum aerobic speed. The ones who showed the least amount of fluctuation were responding the best, or performed the best on the aerobic speed test. This is just examples of how the magnitude of fluctuation is not meaningless, and I don't think you should dismiss the heart rate variability as a useful metric because that amount of variability changes and it actually means something, and you could use it to help assess how individuals are responding to training.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and especially as you mentioned, when you're collecting data longitudinally over a longer time span, you really start to appreciate how the athletes are responding. And if we continue this conversation on your work in college football players and talk a little bit of in-season monitoring, despite having really rigorous in-season training schedules, the research around markers for that daily physiological recovery status, and for football players, American football players, is pretty limited. And of course, you've done some work in this area. Can you share a little bit of some insights from that work and some of the key findings?
Absolutely. And I think before we talk about the in-season, we got to talk about the off-season, which even preceding the preseason program. So the first data collection with football took place during spring camp. So spring camp happens after some off-season strength and conditioning training. So they'll lift 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. They'll condition Tuesday, Thursdays. But there's not a whole lot of actual football taking place. So when we start spring camp, that's really their reintroduction to football training, putting the pads on, hitting, and so on and so forth. And so one of the questions was with measuring HRV in football players is one of the questions was, how are they going to respond to training? But more importantly, we were testing if we're capturing HRV at the training facility as opposed to post-waking, is the data going to be way too noisy to find anything meaningful of it, or is it still somewhat useful despite the fact that there's probably going to be some noise? So those were the motivations of using HRV, experimenting with it during spring camp. And based on the model from that sports medicine paper by Stanley and colleagues, what I would expect is the highest fit individuals to show minimal day-to-day variation because they're recovering well between sessions, whereas the less fit individuals I would expect to show much bigger decrements. And if you know anything about the sport of football, you know that linemen are a pretty unique group of individuals because of their size and stature. I mean,
100%.
they're all 6'4", 320 pounds. They're really incomparable to any other athlete. Well, I shouldn't say any other athlete, but team sport athlete. And so sure enough, what we were seeing is after, and especially because day one of spring camp was a pretty intense day of training, the training loads were pretty high when I compare them to some of the player load values that have been reported in some other teams. So a pretty good dose of training. And the linemen, we only had 5 monitored throughout this period, but pretty much every single one of them showed a major drop in HRV the first time they were exposed to consecutive day training. Whereas the receivers and defensive backs, the more aerobically fit individuals, they were pretty much back at baseline the next day. And then the mid-skill guys, who are characteristic of both linemen and receivers and DBs in terms of their physical characteristics, they're pretty, they're about anywhere from 220 to 250. And whether you're running back or tight end, I mean, you could be from 5'10" to 6'6". So you have some guys that are bigger that are more like linemen, and you have some that are a little bit more like wide receivers and DBs. So we saw a good mix of those guys. Some showed reductions, and some were pretty much HRV was back to baseline the next day. And then we ran, I just wanted to see, does the relationship between the coefficient of variation, so over the entire training camp, the entire spring camp, were those showing the greatest fluctuation, the least fit? And unfortunately, we don't have a standardized fitness test, but I mean, the average player load value throughout the entire 4-week camp, we were using kind of as an indicator of training capacity or their chronic workload. Because training was their major stimulus. They were not doing any outside conditioning. So what we ended up finding was those with the smallest player loads were the linemen, as you would expect, and they had the greatest coefficient of variation, the greatest fluctuation, whereas the receivers and DBs, they had the greatest player load values. They cover the greatest distances. They're the most fit. It's a requirement of their position, and they show the least day-to-day fluctuation. So at the end of spring camp, we were able to say, you know what, we were capturing HRV at, a couple hours before practice. We controlled the conditions. I mean, it was the same time of day every time. They eat their meals at the same. So we were able to loosely control some important variables, and it appeared to be reflecting some useful information. So we decided that, let's continue it through preseason, and I've already kind of given you a rundown of what happened in the preseason. But then now, what about the in-season? We have one paper out that basically looked at, okay, when we perform consecutive day training during the week, and in American college football, Tuesdays are the first football training session of the week, and it tends to be the most intensive. So we wanted to see from Tuesday to Wednesday, what are these HRV responses looking like? And what we found is pretty much the same pattern. The receivers and defensive backs are for the most part returned to normal by the next day. Running backs, linebackers, tight ends show a bit of a reduction, and linemen show the greatest reduction. But there is a difference in magnitude. So in spring camp, the linemen showed really big, large effect size reductions in HRV. They went from, just to give some values, I think an average of 75 to 65, a 10-point drop on RMSSD, LN RMSSD multiplied by 20. So 10-point drop's pretty substantial.
Sure.
But in the in-season, they showed a significant reduction, but it was about half that. Okay.
Interesting.
And this was based over the first 3 weeks of training, to kind of factor in, okay, there might be some week to week variation, but when we averaged it the line were still showing that HRV wasn't fully returned to baseline by the next training day, but the magnitude was smaller. And so, that naturally, well, why is it smaller? A couple of reasons. One, the in-season practice loads on Tuesday weren't as high as the loads that they were experienced during spring camp or even preseason camp. They're about 15 to 22% lower, and these were large effect sizes. So we know that training intensity affects the HRV response, and they're actually getting a less of a dose of training relative to the previous time points that we evaluated them. So that's one major reason, probably why we're seeing less of a reduction in HRV. But also the fact that they just experienced 4 weeks of preseason training in the heat and the adaptations that come along with that, which is plasma volume expansion, the likely increases in fitness and all this stuff, which facilitate better recovery from training. So I can't say for sure why they're showing less of a reduction the next day, the linemen at least, but it probably has to do with fitness level adaptations from preseason training and the overall lower training load. But I could tell you right now, things get ugly as the season progresses, particularly for the linemen, and that's data I'm still working on in terms of writing up the paper.
I could imagine in team sport in general, things start to get sort of ugly as the season goes. And I imagine the guys in the trenches, with the stress of the physical demands and the physical contact. And so with even what you've discussed here of the inability or the reduced ability to recover from some of these sessions, for coaches and support staff trying to address this in terms of some recovery interventions, I know that doing aerobic sessions for bigger guys is not always something that inherently coaches are sort of apt to do. But is that a potential intervention, or what about even some cold water therapies? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and this is something that I think about often. How can I can't really get too much into the data of what we saw, but you can imagine what we saw, particularly among the linemen, and it's how can we prevent this? I think there's a place for low intensity aerobic exercise if the coaches could buy into that, and if the players would be compliant with it, could be helpful. Culture of football too is after a training session, you might see some guys just kind of flip off your shoulder pads, walk into the weight room, and continue doing some guns or getting
Definitely.
some,
Keep going,
which is fine, and you admire the dedication and what. But probably the reality of the situation is after an intense training session where they've probably lost a whole bunch, and I'm specifically talking about the linemen here, they've probably lost a bunch of fluid from perspiration. Mm-hmm. Let's get the pads off as soon as possible, and whether we're using cold water immersion in a traditional sense where it's an ice tub or not, I'm not sure that matters as much as cool the body down, and it doesn't necessarily need to be icy cold. That would certainly accomplish it effectively, but I know there's debate over we should be periodizing cold water immersion. It might be blunting adaptations and inflammation, which could be important, but cool the body down. Jumping in a pool and soaking in that would probably accomplish it effectively. A cooler shower, mm-hmm. or just hop in the ice tub. I think that could definitely be effective. One thing that concerns me about linemen, due to their size, their neck thickness, they're much more prone to sleep apnea, mm-hmm. and so like when we consider what factors really contribute to recovery, I mean, sleep quality is hands down the best one. So I think if we paid a little more attention to can we enhance sleep somehow, whether it's the experience, do they have sleep apnea? How is that affecting their sleep? And then, potentially massage therapy. Definitely the cold water immersion could be effective. We got to be realistic, right? Like
so many hours in the day for sure.
That, but also interventions that might be useful may include biofeedback therapy or yoga or something. I don't know that linemen would buy into that necessarily. So,
sure.
So I mean, there are
the culture
interventions.
Piece is strong there too, right?
Yeah, and then let's not miss the other big thing. What you're dealing with through a competitive season is a lot of the physical stress. And my experience is that training itself in high level athletes is provided the coach isn't just burning out the players with excessive loads, which can happen. But assuming the coach isn't doing that, it's not really the training loads that cause these major reductions in HRV that remain chronically suppressed and lead to illness and some other things that undesirable responses. It's the combination of training, which they could typically tolerate, when you start adding in these additional stressors. Think about it. If you're a college football player, you're stressed about your draft status. You have academics to worry about to remain eligible. Any stressor you could think of starts to become mental, emotional. What people are saying about you on Twitter, like, we don't have to deal with that. We don't know what that stress is like. Or maybe you do. You got a famous podcast here.
No, it is a different world, isn't it? To even a generation ago of elite college stars having to deal with just this constant noise of commentary that they can actually not have to actively decide to tune out, versus before you would just go home and be away from things like that.
Absolutely. And when I was trying to, or when I was looking at some of the available research on linemen and how they're responding throughout a season, there's really not much that's longitudinal throughout the season. We've got HRV data throughout the entire season, and so we'll be able to show when and what happens, and especially what happens to those who show major reductions in HRV, and it should be pretty enlightening. But some of the available research in some cardiology journals looked at just simple pre and post blood pressure and morphological changes in the heart, and compared linemen versus non-linemen. And sure enough, from pre to post season, linemen largely become at least pre-hypertensive, if not hypertensive. And they experience different morphological changes in the heart. They're experiencing much more concentric cardiac hypertrophy, that they're suggesting may be more pathological than functional, whereas the non-linemen are experiencing more eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, which tends to be a little bit more functional. So,
fascinating. Yeah, it's incredible how even the diet would play a role in terms of maintaining that caloric intake to maintain the size for the season is a job in itself too, right?
Man, you're getting at some variables. There's these players, the stress levels. I'm not sure. Cortisol's an interesting hormone because it could either be through the roof with high stress, or it could be completely blunted. So we'd have to get some of those measures. But you have to imagine, with the chronic stress associated with just the long term season, the outside stressors that we've talked about, and whether that's facilitating a catabolic environment where we're starting to lose some lean muscle tissue, and it is explaining some of the weight loss we see in certain players. There's a whole lot of factors into it, but certainly I think managing the big factors that affect your stress and your recovery and so forth, come down to sleep, managing training load a little bit, but really educating the players, and really monitoring. It's interesting. It's so obvious. You're going to see in this data, it's so obvious when things start to go wrong. And if you're not monitoring it in some way, I'm not saying you have to do HRV, but it's pretty simple to do. You see it, especially in the linemen and even in the non-linemen, because the non-linemen handled the season much better. But then there's always inter-individual variation. There's a few where you have some really elite players showing some responses where you're like, what's going on with this guy? And you start asking around, if the athletic trainer, nutritionist, getting to know some characteristics and
bit of background.
Yeah, and you might learn that it could be a lifestyle or a diet issue that may be be
Yeah, great red flag to start that conversation could be pretty valuable.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's so nice to when you're monitoring multiple players in the same position, you don't have to necessarily look at is their overall average the same, but really is their trend. What is the difference in the trend? And when so many of them who aren't getting injured or aren't getting sick are showing a pretty stable trend. There's some day-to-day fluctuation, don't get me wrong, but there's no meaningful change in the rolling average. And so they tend to be I would say, in tolerating training pretty well. But then someone who's built pretty much the same way is responding entirely differently and has cold and flu symptoms from time to time. And it just gives you a great opportunity to ask some questions, engage the athlete, and say, okay, look, what's contributing to this? Because it's different for every individual. It could be a diet issue with one player, could be a sleep issue with another. And so HRV, just if you start to see these changes, it doesn't tell you anything about what the problem is. It just tells you that there might be a problem. And then that's where you got to start, connecting the dots on what may be contributing to this. But every team is different. What I observed in that specific year with that specific team, does it apply to all these other teams? I don't know. But I think we do need to pay a little closer attention to linemen throughout the season and try and mitigate some of these unfavorable responses that we're seeing.
100%. Yeah, very well said. And if we that concept of the smaller skill players and the bigs, obviously more pronounced in physical sports like American football or rugby. But if we bring that over to basketball, I know you've got experience in basketball as well. Would there be any kind of transfer there in terms of some of potentially seeing some similar themes with some of the smaller skill players versus the bigs over the course of a season, with obviously just slightly different somatotype, but I mean there's some pretty heavy and tall guys as well in terms of this total season load there.
Yeah, so my experience with basketball is actually quite limited. I haven't had the opportunity to monitor like a team throughout an extended period of time, so this would be entirely speculative.
Go for it. A little bit of reckless speculation.
Yeah. But yeah, I would assume that larger players, particularly if their aerobic fitness is a little bit lower, would tolerate this length of a season less, not quite as well as smaller, more aerobically fit individuals. Just based on, that relationship's held, with the football guys, with soccer, with rugby. So I don't see why it would be much different. It is a different sport. It depends on how many games a week and the travel. Sure. Drawing on a recent study that Dan Howells and I put out, we looked at the effect of consecutive rugby sevens tournaments and Olympic level players, and they had a domestic tournament one weekend. And domestic doesn't mean they're playing just domestic teams. They're playing elite level opponents locally one weekend, and then the next weekend they're flying a couple countries over and they're playing another tournament against similar opponents, but now we add in the component of travel, and essentially what we found is relative to a 7-day baseline, the tournament held locally provoked some changes in HRV. They weren't statistically significant, but when we look at the individual level, I think 7 out of 10 players demonstrated a reduction in HRV that would be considered meaningful, though not statistically significant. So a local tournament, it's not going to crush HRV in these elite level players, but then they have less than 5 days to prepare for this next tournament, and so when we evaluated HRV responses to the subsequent tournament, we saw much larger reductions in HRV. Now, I can't say that this happens all the time with every single travel, because they had a unique experience in that they had an early flight. I think they were all up around 6 or 6:30 a.m. And they missed a flight connection. So they ended up having to take a bus the rest of the way to the venue or to the hotel. They didn't get in till 3 a.m. So they're up at 6, didn't get to bed till about 3. And then they have a tournament to deal with in the next couple days. So that is probably largely contributing to the responses that we saw, because there was no difference in GPS loads between tournaments. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't more collisions. We didn't have that data. But the high speed running, the total distance, all that was pretty similar between the tournaments. So it wasn't the training load. It probably wasn't the match load that contributed to these differences in HRV responses. But when you combine the stress of competition with the stress of disrupted travel, and maybe potentially some disturbed chronobiology, depending on how far you're traveling and this and that, could always be an issue. But if your meal times are changing, you're sleeping in a different bed, all these little things probably contribute a little bit. Now, when travel goes smoother and it's going on a more regular basis, it's probably tolerated much better. But certainly, that's a stressor to consider.
Absolutely, and definitely something. Canada basketball will be going to China later this year in September for the World Cup, and obviously for all our NBA players, travel is domestic. It's short flights. So as you mentioned, these kind of novel experiences where all of a sudden you're having to log 18 hours or plus on a plane can be pretty disruptive.
Yeah.
Especially when HRV is so good at picking up things in those so-called other 22 hours when you're not training. That you mentioned sleep and travel, mental, emotional stress. So, for people listening in, the athletes, the practitioners, the coaches who maybe are already using HRV but want to start using it if they're not already. Obviously, there's a lot of apps. Does it depend on an athlete's goals in terms of which one might be more suitable? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, in terms, if you want to start implementing HRV, first and foremost, I would say use a third-party validated tool.
Definitely, yep.
I'm a big fan of apps in terms of they enable the convenient implementation. Especially, we could use a heart rate strap, and even more conveniently, we could use a finger sensor. That's what I love about the apps, and I'm appreciative of them. What I don't love about apps is that they try and tell you, and not all of them, but some are trying to tell you if you're recovered or not based on your HRV. Some are trying to tell you how you should train. Mm-hmm. And I understand why they want to do that, but I don't know that anyone who has a really deep understanding of physiology, and I'm not suggesting that I'm there yet, but recovery is a little more complicated than an isolated measure. It's more complicated than your HRV score today versus yesterday. So definitely use an app, but learn to interpret the data yourself a little bit. So make sure the app is giving you access to the raw data so that you could see it. An app that visualizes the data, or if it doesn't, if you know how to do that in Excel or whatever program you want to use, how the data evolves over time. Because I told you the day-to-day fluctuation is meaningful. The direction of the overall trend is meaningful. So first and foremost, get a third-party validated application. I would recommend measuring HRV in the seated position at the same time of day as best as possible. Post-waking would be ideal circumstances. Mm-hmm. But if you can control conditions to a reasonable extent at the training facility or at a hotel, and it's still reasonably the same time of day, you could probably still get some meaningful data. It's going to be a little bit noisier, but it can be useful. In terms of the most convenient way to do this, we've used a 1-minute stabilization period. So have them sit there. We've used in the athletic training room on the training table, for example, where they just sit with their back up against the wall, and I let them hang out for a minute or two. Then I pop the finger sensor on. They could take the iPad. They do the measurement themselves for about a minute. Mm-hmm. I would say that's probably the most convenient and the shortest protocol we can get away with. In terms of doing this frequently, I mean, you're just not going to be able to get away with 5-minute measures, which tend to be the gold standard. I don't, in my environments that I've worked,
goes down pretty quick, right?
Oh man, yeah. I mean,
after week 1,
yeah. You do want to. One of the important variables you might want to control for is recent meal or fluid ingestion. Mm-hmm. This is actually some of the studies I have some of my grad students working on right now is looking at what is the effect of water ingestion and Gatorade ingestion. We know that there is an effect.
Hydration and HRV, right?
Yeah, James Heathers and his colleagues published a paper that just said, look, if you drink, I don't know, it might have been 500 mils of water, it has a pretty robust causes a pretty robust increase in HRV. But the question that I'm asking is, we know there's an effect of water, but how long is it lasting, and is it any different with Gatorade? Because in my experience in the applied sports setting, both as a former athlete and working with teams, they're, and rightfully so, encouraged to hydrate before training. So if you're trying to get HRV in the hours before a training session, you got to be mindful if if their fluid ingestion, if they just drank 500 mils of water or Gatorade and then you measure their HRV, it's going to be completely inflated, and you might as well throw it out. Okay,
Yeah, especially
so
when they're not consistent. One day they have that pint, and the next day they don't. And
yeah, and preliminary results. We need more subjects still. Gatorade may have a bigger and longer effect, probably because the sugar content. I've seen some papers, that increases in HRV, or HRV increases in response to like an injection of insulin. So if I'm connecting dots, I'm thinking, you drink Gatorade, that spikes sugar. There's an insulin response, which increases parasympathetic activity. So there may be a more exaggerated response and maybe an even more prolonged response from Gatorade versus water. We were only looking at a total of 30 minutes after ingestion, and it didn't really come back down to baseline yet. So what we did with football is we were aiming for 90 minutes post meal, or at least 90 minutes fasted as best as possible. And I'll tell you, I mean, you cannot control for that perfectly all the time.
A football team, right?
Yeah, like I said, there's gonna be some noise, but again, you're not measuring HRV to make a huge determination or decision
Absolutely.
right then and there. You're measuring it for the long haul and looking at some day-to-day changes, because suppose they have water one day and it messes up their HRV, it's not a big deal. What you're looking at is the trend over time. And so that gets me kind of to the next recommendation is, first you have to establish a baseline. When you start using HRV, you have to see what's normal. And this could be under normal training conditions. You wouldn't want to start on, I mean, you can start anytime, but without a baseline, you're kind of guessing if you're in a good position now or not. So 1 week tends to be a good amount of time to see what your normal day-to-day fluctuation is, what your average is. And then you could go from there and just see, is the amount of fluctuation increasing or decreasing? And you could just visualize it as, are the scores, HRV values, are they scattering or are they more clustered closely together? The more they fluctuate is indicative of some type of stress or stimulation. There's something going on. And I consider that to be your first indication that there's some stimulation happening, and to be mindful of it. It's not a major warning sign, but it is an indication. Where you really want to be concerned is when the scores start falling below baseline consistently and not bouncing back up to base or to at or above baseline. That's in my experience, if you let that continue long enough, bad things happen in the form of injury, illness, and we have some data that we'll get out there soon enough on that. But and so once you have that baseline, we were measuring HRV like 2 or 3 days a week with the football guys throughout the season. And so we were using a 3-day rolling average, and one bad score, no big deal. Even if it was, a true negative score and there was some fatigue, so what? They're athletes. That's not the end of the world. But if we're in season and the goal is not to accumulate fatigue, okay, then I'm going to keep an eye on that trend. And if it's starting to stay below baseline, then there might be that would
time for conversation, time to do a little bit of detective work.
And you may not have the power to adjust training loads, and that's just the reality of the situation. But that doesn't mean that you can start to pay a little bit more attention to nutritional factors, to recovery interventions, and so on and so forth. It depends on the dynamic between who programs the practices and the loads, and who's monitoring HRV. But that's it. I mean, those are, and then learn about, what has been shown in terms of how HRV responds. Don't be hyper reactive. If you take a black and white approach where high is good and low is bad, you're going to drive yourself crazy. Observe the
chasing
trend.
your tail, right?
Absolutely. And Mark, one thing I want to add, because I think it's important. Someone who's monitoring HRV in athletes, it may be a strength and conditioning coach. It could be a nutrition, the sport nutritionist. It could be an athletic trainer. It could be an intern, right? Every program could be a little bit different. There needs to be communication between the strength and conditioning and the sports medicine and the dietitian, this data needs to be shared because HRV will decrease in response to some form of stress. It could be excessive training, it could be poor sleep, it could be whatever. And a strength and conditioning coach could handle that. But the same type of trend that's associated with fatigue and poor training adaptation, I'm pretty sure is also what we would see in response to a concussion. There's plenty of research out there that shows that HRV goes down in response to concussion, and it does. And if you're a strength and conditioning coach trying to monitor fatigue and looking at this stuff, and an unreported concussion can be an issue. So when you see a trend characteristic of fatigue or poor training adaptation, it's time for a conversation among a few different people, that wear different hats: sports medicine, sport nutrition, etc. Because above all else, the health status of the individual is most important. And it goes back to the limitation of HRV being that it's not telling you what the issue is, but it is a pretty easily obtained objective physiological marker that when it's out of whack, it is telling you something. You don't know what it is. You have to determine what it is. And if you're not even considering that it could be something like that, then you might miss it, and that could be problematic. So
yeah, it's so important to have all that communication, constant communication with the team, and have everyone on board, as you mentioned, because HRV is encompassing so many different variables. So, Andrew, fantastic stuff here today. Before we wrap up, I've got one last question for you.
Sure.
In the next 5 or 10 years, where do you see the evolution of the research on HRV and team sports?
I think there's all these wearable devices that are coming out right now. I'm not sure that that's the ultimate answer. I think for personal use, I think they're great. I think there's some ethical concerns. I mean, what an athlete does at 11 p.m. on any day of the week, how much is that anyone's business other than theirs, right? So
100%.
So the wearables, again, I love the technology because it's enabling things. It's allowing us to collect data more conveniently for the purposes of helping this athlete perform optimally, maintain their health status, right? I think there is such thing as data overload. I think nocturnal heart rate variability, there needs to be more research there because sleep apnea is not all that uncommon, and actually obstructed breathing has been shown to increase HRV. So if we're trying to derive a heart rate variability value from sleep from an athlete that has sleep apnea, we may be getting these false positives saying that, they had a great sleep, they have really high variability. We got to be careful there. So I think I think that it could be very powerful and useful. But I think what we need to do is iron out methodology in terms of what is the best position to measure this in, because the correlation, and from data that I have, the correlation between supine and standing HRV is like 0.6 maybe. So 36% of the variation in your standing HRV is explained by your supine HRV, or vice versa. It's not the same, right? So we need to be consistent. And we need to, and I don't think supine is useless at all. I think supine measures might be more related with aerobic fitness, and I think standing measures are more sensitive to the day-to-day stress and training fatigue and so forth. It's a hunch I have based on some data. But we need to iron out methodology. We need to know, what is the easiest, simplest, quickest, convenient way to obtain HRV? When's the best time to do it? How long from mealtime? Can we shorten it even less than 2 minutes? And my interest in HRV, I'm a proponent of HRV. I think it's extremely useful, but I don't pretend that it's extremely magical and it's a single marker that tells you everything you need to know. We need to just find out what it is useful for. We need more information to determine how it should be used and what we should use it for, but also what we shouldn't, and how we shouldn't be trying to infer too much from an HRV score, like for neuromuscular performance. It may or may not be related at all. So when you're talking about assessing recovery status based on HRV, if you want performance recovery, then measure vertical jump or something. You know what I mean? I would never recommend that someone use HRV in isolation, but the more inputs we could get from different markers of neuromuscular performance and fitness and psychological mental stress and sleep quality, how we could integrate all of this information to better interpret HRV responses, and then we have a better understanding of how we could use HRV to guide training and make interventions along with these other markers. But also when to say, yeah, HRV isn't telling us anything about this particular item over here. So
yeah, that's fantastic, Andrew. I mean, really phenomenal insights, some great wisdom here around the use and application of HRV, especially for team sports. For folks who want to stay connected with your phenomenal work and keep up with your research,